Hi everybody, welcome to Dram Daddy Whiskey. I'm Dan, and tonight we are going to be trying a whiskey that is a bit of a revival. It is a Lost Lantern selection from Dadshat, a Pennsylvania straight rye whiskey finished in a Vermouth cask. So I've talked about Lost Lantern before. I think it's really cool what they do. They travel the country, going to different distilleries, meeting the folks there, seeing what they're all about, what sets them apart, what their story is, and trying a bunch of casks to see if they actually like what they produce. And in sticking with the spirit of what Lost Lantern does, you know, trying to really honor and respect the story and the history of these specific distilleries that they work with, there's actually a good amount of information that gives a pretty good summary of what Dadshat is all about on the back of the label here. Lost Lantern hand-selected this cask from Mountain Laurel Spirits, which is the company that owns and operates Dadshat, which has revived Pennsylvania's historic distilling tradition. The state's whiskey history dates to the colonial era, but by the 1990s, Pennsylvania rye whiskey had disappeared completely. Dadshat has brought it back to life, driven by a deep commitment to the state's history, farmers, and culture. And according to Dadshat, they're actually the first Pennsylvania rye whiskey company in Pennsylvania since the year 1990. So you might see other rye whiskeys that say they're Pennsylvania style, but Dadshat is actually the only one that's a Pennsylvania style and actually in the state of Pennsylvania right now. Just kind of cool. You know, as they say, the history of rye whiskey in Pennsylvania does date back to the 1700s, and when the federal government was first established and they wanted to put a whiskey tax, they wanted to impose one in 1792, there was this sort of event called the Whiskey Rebellion, where these home distillers and other folks who were making whiskey in Pennsylvania, you know, they got up in arms. I don't think literally, but it was a big deal to them that what they saw as their right was being taken away, and they were going to be taxed on their ability to make this whiskey and to sell it. In the 1800s, they continued making lots of whiskey in Pennsylvania. Millions of gallons were coming out of Pennsylvania, but prohibition really had a huge effect on the Pennsylvania rye whiskey distilleries, and they all but disappeared up until 1990, when the last one finally did bite the dust, until Dadshat came back and started making their whiskey again. But let's talk about the whiskey in the bottle itself. We are looking at a 60% ABV, so 120 proof. This unique release was made by finishing 4-year-old Dadshat straight rye whiskey for 5 months in an ex-Vermouth cask. So enough about the history and about how they operate. Let's try the sucker out. And holy smokes, this whiskey, it's basically red. It's pretty cool. Give it a swirl and give it a nose. Whoa, super sweet. Smells like it has a wine finish on it. If you handed this to me and I just took a whiff of it, there is spice there for sure, baking spice, I'd say, but that vermouth presence is really, really strong in this. And let's look again at the aging. So a 4-year-old rye whiskey finished for 5 months in an ex-Vermouth cask. It's a little surprising how big of an influence that had then. Maybe those vermouth barrels weren't completely dried out when they put the rye whiskey in there. I don't know, because it's a really strong influence. And that's not at all a bad thing. There's a lot of sweetness up front. You do get that rye spice, but then there is surprisingly a little bit of oak or some kind of, you know, I hesitate to say astringency on the nose because that kind of has a bad connotation, but there is a bit of dryness there that I think actually complements the spice and the sweetness really well. But there's also a tiny, tiny bit of sourness there too. Yeah, and the more I smell it, the more I pick up on that when I focus on it too. I'm not sure how this is all gonna play out in the palate. Let's see. Whoa. Yeah, that's 120 proof. Holy crap. Weirdly enough, I'm not getting a huge Kentucky hug, or I guess in this case a Pennsylvania hug, but it gets you up front, smacks you in the mouth. I got hit immediately with the rye spice. I don't think any kind of like chili pepper or anything too spicy like that. Maybe black pepper, white pepper, and something sweeter, like a nutmeg or something like that, or something a little bit more earthy. Okay, palate a little more acclimated that time, not getting attacked right away. I do get that vermouth a ton up front, it carries all the way through actually to the back this time. That's weird. The second sip was way different than the first. I didn't really get a lot of baking spice on it. Wow. I don't know. I'll have to give this another couple of sips to really see what I think about it when I'm picking it up. That tartness from the vermouth is there. It's really, really present in the front palate, and then the rye spice is starting to come through this time more in the mid to the back palate. It all sticks around in the finish. This is pretty viscous, pretty oily as you might expect for 120 proof. It doesn't really fade from any part of the palate. So those flavors, at least for me, that I'm picking up on each part of the palate, they stay consistently through the finish. They're not really changing at all from what I first picked up, which might sound kind of boring, but it's actually kind of cool because the development on the palate actually is pretty, dare I say, sophisticated, especially for a single barrel, where I'm picking up something on the front palate, something different on the mid palate, and kind of a blend of them on the finish. The mash bill on this is pretty weird too. It's 80% rye, 15% barley malt is what they call it, which I assume is malted barley, and then 5% rye malt, which I assume is malted rye. So there's no corn in here at all, which is a little unusual for a rye. That definitely makes sense based on what I'm tasting. I'm not really picking up on any of those standard corn notes, certainly not the sweetness that I would normally associate with any kind of a bourbon or like a Kentucky rye or anything like that. The vermouth, the pepper's coming through a little bit more the more that I drink it, maybe even a little bit of like, green chili notes faintly on this one in the back, and that's creeping to the front a little bit more. But those I'd say are the two primary notes, that vermouth up front mainly, and then it transitions more into the rye notes as it develops to the back palate and into the finish. There's a tartness that kind of comes through on the finish, at least that's when it's more noticeable, that I think works really well, kind of accents the other notes that you pick up on the palate, the sweetness from the vermouth, and just I guess the wininess of it, plus that spice that I get on the back palate. The tartness that kicks in works really well with those. I'm a fan of this one. I don't know that it's the kind of whiskey that I would reach for on any given night. You gotta be in the mood, I think, for something strong, obviously, because it's 120 ABV. That's toward a Manhattan, but not quite there. You definitely have to be in the mood for something leaning in those very specific directions. High ABV whiskey, different sort of rye, without any of those fresh notes, and maybe toward a Manhattan. If that seems like it would fit your bill on any given night, then this is probably the one for you. If not, then maybe more of a mood pour. So a score on this one, I would say this is a pretty good whiskey, maybe even a really good whiskey. I think a 7.5 is a good score for it. I think the grade on this one is a B-. It's pretty interesting. It's not super complex. It's not completely blowing my socks off, even though I do enjoy it. But it was pretty expensive too, 100 or 110 or something like that. But I mean, it's a cask strength finished rye, so that kind of comes with the territory. Leave a comment if you think I got something wrong, whether you think this is worth the money or not. I'd love to hear what folks think about releases like this and about Lost Lantern in general too. Until next time, cheers.